and we are live with episode 36 of the Wake Up Podcast. And on this one, I've got a guy with a brilliant name. His name is also Alex. It's the best name to have. It's Alex Gladstein from the Human Rights Foundation. And dude, thank you for coming on. I've wanted to have a chat with you for a while now, and I think this is a topic that gets a lot of airtime around Bitcoin. But before I dig into what we're going to discuss, thank you for coming on, man, and appreciate you putting some time aside for this.
Excited to be here.
Sure. So, as we were discussing in a little preamble beforehand, we don't. This is going to be a relatively. It's going to be an open discussion type podcast where I hope that we can both walk away getting a lot in terms of nuance around the ideas of democracy, free markets, poverty, so how human beings interact in society, what structures might, emerge that are functional, what are not functional, etc. So there's a bunch of things I want to dig into. I if you've got nothing to add for the beginning and you're happy for me to just sort of start with like an opening contention, I'd be happy to kick off.
No, I'm excited to talk about this topic. Obviously, I think we will be drawn at some point into Bitcoin, but previous to Bitcoin, I spent a lot of time thinking about democracy, property rights, free markets, and how that has manifested, not necessarily theoretically. I'll be more helpful on like giving practical examples of societies around the world and how they're structured and what they've achieved and what outcomes they've had. So that's kind of what I'm looking forward to, is kind of like doing that kind of comparative analysis of, what different groups of people have teamed up to do and how they've prioritized democratic values, property rights, and free markets, and kind of what are the outcomes so far. So that's what I'm looking forward to getting into.
Yeah, awesome. All right, so I guess to open this up then, my sort of opening contention, I've got a bunch of notes written here, so I'm going to try and read out my first note so that I've got the thought pattern right. But my opening contention is that progress via democracy has been conflated with actual progress that's a function of free markets, instead of it being more accurately represented as sort of, democracy is this parasite which has benefited from the prosperity of free markets and continued to leech sort of resources, capacity, and energy alongside. So my, I think the first area that I want to sort of, that's the opening statement from my side. And then, what I want to dig into is maybe defining property rights, and then sort of the color between private property rights and public property rights, but also sort of trying to separate and tease out democracy from property rights and from free markets, because I don't think they're people lump them together, but I don't think that they are necessarily dependent on each other. They just sort of seem to emerge. They seem to have emerged in some sort of combination or package in different ways throughout society, which is an interesting thing for me.
Okay. So I guess a lot of what I'm going to be saying is that, again, from what I've observed, there's a climate in which, and we can go back and forth about the relationship between property rights and free markets, but essentially there's like a particular climate in which property rights and free markets do very well in. There's like a political soil that they do well in, and there's a political soil that they obviously don't do well in. And the best starting metaphor for that I would give the audience is to think about the Korean Peninsula. And you can look at the Korean Peninsula at night from satellites, and you can look this up online. And the Korean Peninsula is half completely black, and it's half vibrant and glowing light, right? And The difference is not the genetics of these people. They were the same. They were split by proxy, third powers after World War II and through the Korean War. And they were dragged in one direction by the communists and one direction by the Americans. Okay. They both were dictatorships for decades. And for a long time, actually, North Korea had a better quality of life than South Korea. But the South Korean government allowed small personal freedoms in the 1970s and especially in the 1980s that manifested eventually in multi-party democracy in the late 1980s. And since then, certainly it's a country that still has a lot of socialized, sort of subsidized healthcare and things like that. They, in fact, the entire history of K-pop and the Korean wave was subsidized by the government. And a lot of obviously what happened with Samsung and LG was subsidized by the government. I mean, people used to call Samsung Samsung, right? And then it crushed Sony like 10 years later. So, a lot of what happened in South Korea, was the result of a political soil that went in the other direction from like the totally closed off, autarkic, communist North Korea, right? So today, South Korea is one of the world's most prosperous countries. It has issues, but politically, it's quite free. So much so that they have this pattern of jailing the elected leader for corruption charges quite brazenly. I think 2 of the last 3 are now in prison. So the leaders are really controlled by the people in an interesting way. And there's a lot of free speech. Obviously, there's a lot of opportunities for North Koreans who've escaped to like now even they go to South Korea and then they can get voted into office. And now there's like 2 North Koreans who are part of the Senate there. And that has obviously birthed this incredible economic and cultural powerhouse that wins Oscars and makes things that are in our pockets and is really just a civilization to be proud of. It's an incredible civilization. Again, we're several decades away from it being the same situation as a country which now only exports death and suffering, which is a black hole at night, and which is, basically a feudal society that it serves at the pleasure of the Kim regime. So the political soil, I would argue, is necessary for property rights and free markets. Like you can't really have property rights and free markets unless you have an open society, is what I've kind of observed around the world. And the same would be for Cuba versus Costa Rica, Norway versus Belarus. What you're seeing grow now in Tunisia versus stuff like Saudi Arabia, and certainly even in Africa, when you look at stuff like Botswana or Ghana versus Eritrea or Ethiopia. So I would just say that like, no matter what part of the world you're in, the property rights and free markets, I just, from what I've observed, they require a particular kind of political soil first. So that's why I would argue that they're not leeching, but rather they are a precursor for the glories that we get with free markets.
Okay, so then what I would ask then is what was the soil in which free markets or voluntary trade emerged prior to what we know as the modern democracy?
Yeah, so again, similar to like what I was hinting at with South Korea when it was still like a dictatorship in the 1970s and 80s, like it allowed these small personal freedoms. So obviously, like a lot of the free market ideas and practice of trade, global trade, came from Northern Europe, in the last 500 years. There's certainly instances before that across Africa, ancient Greece, all over. I mean, that did trade, of course, beforehand. Look at the freaking, Marco Polo. But the point of like industries growing around this was highlighted and really became a force in the last several hundred years in Northern Europe, right? And those societies were not like liberal democracies as we know them today. Like, women didn't have the right to vote, like refugees and ethnic minorities weren't the same. But they started to allow small personal freedoms, and especially small like financial personal freedoms. And they started to protect property rights, and they did it not out of altruism, but because it helped grow their societies, and they saw it. I mean, they saw this economic growth engine, and the rulers of these countries, largely acceded to that because they saw what direction it was going in. So I would
Yeah.
argue, yeah, just to finish that thought. So they would argue.
Yep.
So I would argue that these kind of pre-democracies, colonial powers and stuff in Northern Europe that really helped usher in the age that we know today, of like global trade and commerce and stuff. They were different from like more maybe inward looking societies in that they offered these like small personal freedoms for their citizens that later became hallmark features of what we now know as like a liberal democracy.
Yeah, so I think this is an important area to sort of dig into here, because from my study of history, I guess there's a really good book called Energy and Civilization by a guy called Vasil Vaclav, I think, or something like that.
Oh,
Do
it's
you have
this
it?
one. Yeah.
That's the one. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's excellent.
So
I agree. Excellent.
yeah. So and I think what he does really well is he outlines how the the transformation and the progress of society is actually a function of the capacity of human beings to extract and use energy. And he starts all the way back from humans evolving as a bipedal species, and then allowing the brain to evolve and all sorts of other things. And the story of humanity is us being able to better harness energy, extract energy, and use energy
Mhm.
for technological innovation. And as we evolve technologically, we do more with less. We become better users of resources. And the I would say the other piece that he doesn't talk too much about in that book, but I think that runs parallel alongside our capacity to extract and use energy better, is actually the thing that has enabled us to do that, which is a mechanism via which to solve the coincidence of wants, which we know as money. Like you can't have human beings extract energy, use energy, and do all these sorts of things without money. Like, it doesn't work. We all want different things at different times. We produce different things at different times at varying rates. So as a result of that, we need to trade. So I actually, when I view society, I sort of view it as the process of human beings voluntarily trading, and in doing so, we actually multiply wealth, or we add wealth, versus the corollary, which is whether it's coercion, whether it's theft, whether it's corruption, that has a subtractive effect on our capacity to take energy, harness it, and move it forward. So, for me, I look at, whilst we've had all sorts of different forms of, human collaboration, whether it's, city states or empires or kingdoms or feudalism or whatever, along the way, the driving force for progress was not so much the frameworks within which we were operating, but it was actually the voluntary trade that happened inside whatever the frameworks. So when we talk about prosperity and wealth and all the nice things that we kind of see in so-called democratic societies today, they're not, my contention is that they're not a function of democracy. They're actually a function of free markets, private property, and the voluntary trade amongst participants. And that existed before democracy, and it'll exist after democracy. But democracy has this sort of, in some ways, gives more room for that. But in other ways, I kind of sometimes like to frame it as a more sophisticated method of theft, because it it gives the constituents of a society enough space to innovate and produce, and just takes all their shit after the fact, as opposed to what the idiots in more autocratic or authoritarian societies do. That those idiots, they just go and take all the shit up front, so then no one produces anything. So you end up with a North Korea type situation. So yeah, I guess the delineation that I want to draw there is not that that democracy offers a fertile soil for free markets, is that free markets are the driver, and have created a fertile soil for a more sophisticated form of coercion, parasitism, and theft, which I would call modern democracy. So I kind of think it's the other way around, because that's the thing that's been with us from the beginning of time. Like free trade, or even not free trade, even black market trade, trade is the driver of progress, not the political system.
Yes, two main questions for you. Totally agree about humankind's progress in line with our capacity to find, discover, mine, harvest, and use energy, especially per capita, and how that's led to mass electrification, sanitation, and prosperity. I mean, obviously, the first question is, how do you view the relationship between the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution? I'm someone who believes that we had to have the Enlightenment first. We had to have this idea that we could be liberated from our kings, and that the merchant classes could have power, and that it created that space for us to actually have that industrial revolution. Second, I think we have to ask, what is democracy in your view? Because my view, and I want to be specific here, because like every moron gets elected from Kim Jong-un to Hitler. When I say democracy, it is shorthand for liberal democracy, which is the marriage of classic liberal values with multi-party politics, meaning that these are societies that are first and foremost at the bottom. They have free speech and constitutional protections. And then on top of that, they have civil society and balance of power. And then only at the very top do they have elections. The elections are just merely a mechanism for changing the people in power. It is not the hallmark of a democracy, in my view. The hallmark are these like civil liberty type things, these negative rights that we have, that we've built a system so that we're ruled by rules, not by rulers. And that is what I define as liberal democracy. And my organization, the Human Rights Foundation, estimates that about 46% of the world lives under some sort of liberal democracy, and the other 54% under an authoritarian regime. So we've made a lot of progress, from our point of view. And again, just to recap. So number one for you, how do you view the Enlightenment versus the Industrial Revolution? And then number two, kind of like, what is your definition of democracy?
Yeah, the Enlightenment one is an interesting one. So I recently have been reading a little bit more in depth on Japanese history, of all things, actually, and looking at sort of the feudal times, and really interesting to see how the class structure in Japan was formed. So you had the etas at the bottom, which were the sort of the shit people who would dig graves and work with meat for whatever. Then at the second lowest rung was the merchants. Was the people who made the money. Then you had the peasants who sat above the merchants. Then you had, I think, the maybe samurai, or there might have been something between them and samurai. And then you had sort of the nobles and the shogun and probably emperor at the top. But what was interesting was I actually am writing a piece at the moment which talks about why the British and the so-called West actually trumped quite a functional and sophisticated country, being Japan, that they managed to quote unquote dominate Japan, and the samurai class and all that sort of stuff fell apart because the feudal system in Japan had tried to lock the merchant in down the bottom, where the merchant is the layer of society that is the most meritocratic in nature. It's the one that creates some sort of dynamic movement, right? So the merchant is the one who goes and builds or creates or does something, adds input into society via a product or a service, and earns a profit. And and the profit is purely a relationship between the value delivered and any excess that was that someone subjectively valued on the other end. So the Enlightenment one is an interesting one because I mean, because we weren't here, we weren't there, 500 years ago, or 800 years ago, whatever time frame we want to sort of give on the Enlightenment, and this idea that humans were could transcend their could transcend the I guess the core message for me in the Enlightenment might be also a little bit different than what you said. It's not so much transcending the monarchic kind of structure, but transcending the idea that you're stuck in a specific class. And I don't know if that was purely
well, that we could be individuals, that we could be individuals.
Yeah, well, that's I think the distinction, but I think that I don't know whether that is first and foremost political in nature per se, and B, I would also argue that that was it was a realization that had emerged prior to that as well. Like, it was a realization that has some roots also in Christianity, has roots in all sorts of different societies throughout history, has roots definitely in sort of the Greek, Macedonian, all that sort of period, city states and stuff like that. So the idea of the individual does exist throughout that time. I think that it's a I don't have a strong opinion here about what came first or what was more important there, but
no, it's in it. Before we get to the second question, just to conclude here for now, and then we'll move on. Maybe we'll come back. But it's a big one for me. I mean, it's very important because, again, like I'm coming at it from a realization based on not just historical evidence, but like obviously Enlightenment values did not come to all countries at the same time. So we've been able to actually, again, I've given you the Korea example. We're kind of watching it happen in recent history too. And you brought up this really good point about the merchant being key, or maybe we call it today the entrepreneur, etc. The connector. I would argue that like wherever the merchant or the entrepreneur can be the most free to unlock humanity's potential, that's going to be the best society. And I guess my argument again is that like that's going to be in liberal democracies, not in any other kind of existing political structure. I cannot pontificate about what we're going to have in 50 years or whatever. But clearly, like, there's a bunch of different regime types in the world today that people live under, from totalitarian to, sort of like social democracy. And I just, can see that if you look at like patent rates or Fortune 500 company types or technologies that have really bettered the world in a huge way over the last 50 years, those tend to come from what we call open societies or liberal democracies, overwhelmingly, not from dictatorships. Like, especially if you look at patent rates, look at Middle East versus Europe. I mean, it's not even close, man. Scientific innovation tends to come from freer societies, is what I want to say. Yeah,
absolutely, from freer societies. Now, my I guess position is that democracy is a even. Anyway, before we get into the semantic discussion about that, just quickly, I think would be really useful to define, throw out what you understand as sort of some of the Enlightenment values. Let's define these, because I think we can come back to these later on when we're discussing, definitions around, what does democracy actually mean?
Sure. So, I mean, for me, the U.S. Bill of Rights is a fabulous document. That really captures a lot of these Enlightenment values, right? So free speech is a huge one. We would say free speech is like up there. Freedom of association, property rights. These three are absolutely crucial. To a larger extent, you have this like freedom of belief / freedom of and from religion. I mean, this is a big one. So, and then, for me, and this is where you and I might disagree, the right to participate in your government, right? So this is like the right of the citizenry to have influence over the officialdom. that is a really key one for me. And there's many ways to do that. There's direct democracy, there's representative democracy, there's all sorts of things. Those are some of the biggest freedoms and rights that came out of the Enlightenment, for me at least. And they lead to things like civil society groups, journalism, free press, a due process, court systems, independent judiciary, all that good stuff. So those would be some of the ones I would be most inspired by, and they allow for scientific inquiry. Like once you have a free press and you don't have to be worried about blasphemy, like freaking all these scientists did in the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, they were going to get hanged if they said that the Earth went around the sun. So once you can like be free in scientific inquiry through free expression protected by law, oh my God, then you can really get going. You can really get going, right? So those would be the way I would say it.
Yeah, interesting. So the point that you made then about the blasphemy and getting hung about your differing opinion 500-600 years ago that the Earth revolves around the sun and not the other way around. I think a lot of the drivers for freedom of speech, again, I don't think were political. I think were actually market driven, because you got to remember that the people who supported these so-called blasphemers back then were monarchs, were nobles, were these sorts of people who were economically driven, not politically driven per se, because it made more sense. Like this is sort of why the Florentine families and sort of it's particularly Venice as well. Like, I mean, Alan Farrington did that brilliant piece on Bitcoin is Venice. If you had a chance to read that.
Totally agree with you. So can you help me distinct? Why does that matter? Like what I'm saying is that private property and like the separation of power of the people from the state is the real key thing here. So why does it matter whether it was market driven or politically driven?
Because this comes back to the fertile ground comment that you made earlier, is that these ideas didn't emerge because of the fertile ground of democratic thinking or that, but they emerged as a market necessity, which is the driving force that. So again, it comes back to, through the gravity of economic reality, which is, you want to, I guess, the USSR is a good example for this. Is they neglected economic reality and they tried to make up their own numbers and fake all this bullshit, and then everyone starved to death, right? So when you ignore reality, at some point, gravity catches up with you, and it, you pay the consequences of that. So I think the transformation and the Enlightenment values were not driven by some sort of political enlightenment, but they were actually driven by reality catching up with observation, basically.
Got it.
So I think that's just yeah.
Okay, let's dwell on the USSR for a second. I mean, obviously, the most geopolitically significant event of the last 150 years was you have essentially the Second World War, you have the Cold War, right? So USSR, I mean, the way I would interpret this, again through my lens, is that you cannot have private property and free trade unless you have a democracy, because or at least a democratic society. An open society that has balance of power and things like that. When all power accrues to the hands of a few, in this case, the Politburo or whatever, bunch of fattened communist officials, right? They get to decide everything for everybody else. Then you're obviously not going to have private property, because if they disagree with you, they're going to come take your shit. And they're not going to have free trade either, because they're going to align the incentives of the country according to their personal interests, not towards, what's best for the market. So I guess what I'm saying here is there's a great example. And the Cold War really was a battle between, two political economic structures and ways of being. One would be centrally controlled society that doesn't have property rights and doesn't internally have free trade or entrepreneurship in the same way. And then you have a more open society that wasn't perfect, but certainly defeated the Soviets. And that's the sort of more American value based on a Bill of Rights and on Enlightenment values, and had open society with multi-party politics and elections, right? So that's what colors a lot of my thinking.
I would argue that the Russia ended up there because of the fall of the monarchy. So they were much better off before, way better off before they were communist, for example. So,
yeah. Let's the starvation of the Ukrainians and the various transport-driven genocides is a low bar. Yeah, that's
correct.
Low bar.
Well, I think the agreement we can probably easily throw off the table here is just the idea that communism, socialism, authoritarian dictatorships and all of that sort of stuff is the bottom of the barrel, right? That is the lowest bar, and just about anything beats that, which I think we can agree with. But I want to bring up just another example here of one place which I think is really important. I'm just trying to unlock my computer here so that I can grab my notes. But so speaking about enlightenment and stuff, so I've got a little bit of a note written here, which is corruption is the ultimate source of poverty because it erodes wealth instead of multiplying it. Free voluntary markets multiply. But the important part here that I've written next is Hong Kong as an example. So Hong Kong's got a really interesting history, and it was sort of basically emerged as a laissez-faire free market, basically an island for pirates. If there's any way to easily put it. I don't know if you know much about the history of Hong Kong, sort of how it emerged and things like that. But it emerged as sort of the trading port for everything that was considered illegal to trade back then. So I'm pretty sure it was the British sailors who would can't remember if the silver was coming from. I'm pretty sure the silver was coming from India, and they were buying opium. Or they were getting the silver from somewhere. Maybe it was Japan, and they were getting from China, and they were getting the tea from India, and they were sort of figuring out the trade in between. And that's actually what propped up England, because England was fucked in the late 1800s, or in the mid to late 1800s, as sort of it was subsumed in politics as opposed to free markets, and it was sort of that external trade that was interesting. And Hong Kong kind of was immune to politics and to democracy and to all this other stuff for much of the time, until obviously recently, where
I'm so happy you brought this up. I mean, this could not be more timely. And just for the audience, so today, the Hong Kong, as I guess Alex is pointing out, boasted a lot of economic freedoms for a long time, and we'll get into that in a second. But just today, Hong Kong basically has been dropped from the Economic Freedom Index by the conservative U.S. Heritage Foundation, which has always tried to measure these things in terms of free trade, property rights, stuff like that. Dropped completely, excluded actually, because they now view Hong Kong as basically a total creature of Beijing. So this is exactly in our argument. I mean, for me, the reason why Hong Kong was able to thrive over the years was it had sovereignty. It had its own way of doing things. It was not, unduly controlled by Beijing. It had elections. In fact, I've met many people who were elected in these relatively free and fair elections. They had good free speech. Wasn't perfect, but it was an island of Enlightenment values in what was, to the west, obviously a sea of communism. So, I mean, that's, what made it such a powerhouse. And we're about to see that, unfortunately, get crushed. I mean, no one's going to really want to do as much business in Hong Kong anymore. They're getting dropped from all these charts. People are fleeing. I mean, it's going to become a total police state. That there are signs that a lot of what's happened in Xinjiang and Tibet, man, it sounds absurd, but I mean, the police, the way that they police the territory in Hong Kong now, they're using a lot of tactics from Xinjiang and Tibet. So, I mean, the Chinese government is basically crushing the hell out of Hong Kong, and it's no longer going to be that economic beacon. So I'm glad we're covering this.
Yeah, I mean, Hong Kong's such a inspirational story, and it's such a sad outcome. Into like, I think I actually first came across you because we were both sort of tweeting about Hong Kong and stuff like that when all the stupidity was happening. So you and I 100% see eye to eye here, and I kind of, I guess, people might call the diversion of our opinion, semantics, around the differences between how we define democracy. But I guess, really where, I think there's some divergence of opinion is not so much just in the semantics, though. It's also in the outcome that a democratic form of governance will always tend to lead to. And I guess, if we look at, bring up some of these Enlightenment values. So you mentioned free speech, freedom of association, property rights. I would adjust property rights to private property rights, because I don't think any other property rights matter.
That's what I mean.
Yeah.
That's what I mean. That's what I mean.
Yeah. So, and freedom of belief or of and from religion, all these sort of things, they're basically the idea that the individual is the logos, or the most, it's the atomic unit of society. And if you don't allow the individual to be the cornerstone or the atomic unit of society, and you sort of replace the individual with a homogeneous mass, we end up with going down the path of authoritarianism in whatever flavor it is, whether it's communism, socialism, whether it's a bad monarch, whatever it is, right?
Yeah, we agree completely. And just to add color here for the audience, the human rights struggle and industry is actually really interesting, because it was essentially, of course, we had Enlightenment values and all these things, and suffrage movement and all these amazing historical forces. But really, like, the industry itself was created in the wake of World War II, in the wake of what's called the Universal Declaration for Human Rights. And if you actually look at it, it's a compromise between, again, the liberal democratic United States and the communist Soviet Union. And it's funny because it's really split right down the middle if you read it. The first half are negative rights, which, Alex, you and I would probably agree are human rights. These are like things that we individuals have that governments shouldn't take from us, and we've covered those. The other half are entitlements, like the right to housing, the right to food, and the right to a vacation and stuff like that. So it's funny because the Soviets came in and they were like, we're only going to sign this document if you guys include all these things. And the US was like, well, okay, fine. And we sort of had this negotiation. Later in the 70s, there were two new documents called the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and then the International Covenant on Social and Economic Rights. So ICCPR is what the Human Rights Foundation, that's our founding document. It's like this international Bill of Rights. It's awesome. And it allows us to not have to use the UN, the other one, which is packed with entitlements, right? So the interesting thing here is that what would happen after this in the last 60, 70 years is that the dictatorships would claim to have half of the the UN human rights document totally sealed up, and they're delivering on those. They'd be like, look, we've got all this housing, and we provide entitlements and a minimum wage and all this stuff. And in reality, like, no one could ever verify that, because they didn't allow a free press, and they had no private property, and they had no actual liberties, right? So I think that's a really important distinction to make, is like between these two kinds of human rights. And the people like me who would self-characterize as progressives, or at least me personally, that's kind of the way I like to think of myself. What we see is that once you have this foundation of liberties, then you can grow those entitlements on top, but not through force, but through society sort of figures it out. So like, this is why when you compare like Norway to Belarus, or like Chile to Cuba, or whatever, like if you strip away all the bullshit in terms of like propaganda, or Costa Rica to Cuba, or South Korea to North Korea, or whatever, like the democratic countries that ensure some level of Enlightenment values in the form of constitutionally protected negative rights or liberties, they have better social programs than the dictatorships, like by far. Like people live longer, they're more educated, they die of like dysentery less often, they have higher literacy rates, lower maternal death rates. There's no refugees. Like refugees don't come from liberal democracies, they come from dictatorships. 96% of all refugees come from dictatorships. So, all these human issues we struggle with, abject poverty, lack of access to clean drinking water, all these like big human issues, like liberal democracies generally and quite specifically don't have those issues because they figured it out. And they figured it out through securing these Enlightenment values first. And then like they sort of let the market figure out the social rights, which I don't really consider rights in my mind. Like I don't think you have a right to housing. I think that like sort of society can help figure that out. But I don't oppose. I guess where maybe we would differ is I don't oppose a system that comes together like the US or Norway or Switzerland that says we're going to take some of the tax money that we get from taxpayers and we're going to use that to like help the most vulnerable. And I think like Adam Smith sort of thought that way too, if you actually read him. So that's kind of where I stand.
Yeah, interesting. So I think you touched on it. So I've got a whole section here of questioning that I wanted to do later on, but fuck it, we'll bring it up now, which is human rights versus property rights. And I wrote a piece recently called Utopian Dystopias, and I sort of talk about how there's a series of sections in there where I say if you optimize society for safety over freedom, there's certain consequences that you're gonna, there's certain ramifications. If you optimize for equality instead of fairness, you're gonna get a certain set of consequences. And so for me, like for example, in the first one, if you optimize for safety or freedom, what you end up doing is, for safety, you actually have to give up a bunch of freedoms. And in doing so, you basically build, you get the illusion of protection in the short term, but you create a prison in the long term. Whereas if you optimize society for freedom, initially it might seem a little less unsafe, but you actually build a more robust society.
Totally agree. Totally agree.
So that's sort of one dichotomy. The other one, equality versus fairness.
But just to stay on that first point for a second, I would agree not only on safety with you, but on everything else, education, innovation. Like if you secure the freedom piece first, you get the other stuff way better than if you go 100%. If you try to shortcut it. That's a good way of just sort of encapsulating my whole story about the UN, human rights doctrine.
Yeah, 100%. And this is so the three big sort of frameworks that I put out in this document were safety, freedom, equality, fairness, and the other one is rights versus responsibilities. And I kind of tried to boil down human rights to sort of one single right, which is sort of a private property right or the right to choose. And I guess, to your point about rights and entitlements is what a lot of people don't realize when they say things like, the right to housing, is a human right. It's like, it's not actually a human right because what it is somebody else's responsibility. And in being somebody else's responsibility, it actually removes their one fundamental right, which is their right to choose. So I've sort of tried to boil down all rights in this article. What I should have done was I probably should have sent that to you before we actually had this conversation so we could actually dig into a couple of these things. But there's a really interesting excerpt which I love from Ayn Rand's book Atlas Shrugged, where I'll read it out to you because I think it's
sure.
it's really poignant for this thing. So she says that human rights versus property rights is a fraud. One cannot exist without the other. And when property rights are violated for some made up human rights, we're right back at slavery. Only a ghost can exist without material property. Only a slave can work with no right to the product of his effort. The doctrine that human rights are superior to property rights simply means that some human beings have the right to make property out of others. Now, since the incompetent have far more to gain from the competent than vice versa, it means the right of the incompetent to own their betters and use them as productive cattle. Whoever regards this as human and right has no right to the title of human. So it's a really interesting quote for me. And she sort of wrote this back in the 40s
Yeah,
or
I mean,
50s.
obviously
So,
you can hear that she was doing this in the heart of that debate between what the Soviets tried to say were human rights and then what they were classifying as American property rights. Today we've moved on, and again, people like me view property rights as one of the key fundamental cornerstones of society, right there with free expression and freedom of association, and multi-party politics. I guess the question is, throughout our conversation today, is exploring where do those other rights fit in? And again, just to reiterate, I would say that it's very difficult to, and we'll get to Bitcoin because I think it changes things. But pre-Bitcoin, you can't really have property rights, in my opinion, based on evidence and history and studying like the world as it is. Very difficult to have property rights in true free trade, because free trade assumes that the people trading own the shit they're trading. Very difficult to have that stuff without, truly without, political freedom on both sides.
Yeah, I've always grappled with the property rights problem because property, I always say, starts with you as the individual. You're your first bit of property. Your next bit of property is your thoughts, right? So your capacity to think and decide, and to believe in whatever you want to believe in. And then sort of property extends radially from you. So it's who you are, what you can think about, then what you mix your time and effort with, what you mix your energy with. And you sort of, property extends from there. And it's, as we extend out of that though, the further property extends from you radially, the more difficult it becomes to defend and to delineate, right? So I've sort of quoted in the past, and I'm still sort of undecided about this, but it's sort of, property is that which you can defend, that which you can successfully
or that
the claim.
And that defense either comes from like basically physical defense or social institutions. So for example, like this is to me the big difference between China and the United States, for example, just to use another one of these examples. Here, like, I have a home, I own it. If someone tries to like come and take it from me, you can try physical defense, or you can like just walk down to the police station and file a report. And like, because we have like a independent court system and due process and stuff like that, they will go arrest that person for breaking the law, and I will have my house back. So that's not necessarily the case in China. If I'm a Communist Party official, I just want to like take somebody's shit, I can fucking do it because there is no rule of law. So rule of law, to me, really is key to unlocking this like world where we have private property, properly understood, and free trade. If you don't have that rule of law, which necessarily cannot exist if you have arbitrary political power, then you don't really have these things, right?
Yeah, so agreed in the case of China, absolutely. I think we sign a Faustian bargain by giving a institution a monopoly on enforcing. This is where I think the problem lies, is we give a public institution the right to, first of all, define what private property is, but also then enforce private property rights. Now, that public institution doesn't have any skin in the game, and as a result, we end up with weird deformations of the so-called protection of these private property rights.
Let's be like a little less theoretical. Those public institutions are created by the people. So I live in a state called California. We, the voters, get to fucking make up the laws. So in the 1970s, we voted to halt property taxes. And it's done like some weird shit in our state since then. But that was not some like random bureaucrat deciding that. We decided that. Now, we didn't have a lot of foresight, in my opinion, and that was probably a bad idea for different reasons. But hey, I wasn't around then. We, the citizens of California, voted that way. That's not how shit works in China or in dictatorships. Like public institutions are tools of the regime, but that's it. Like in liberal democracies, public institutions can be changed by the people. So I think that's a very important distinction. And it has led to the protection of private property in the United States, like at a scale that would be unimaginable hundreds of years ago. Like the richest people in the country and the president, no less, cannot just like do whatever they want, which is pretty crazy when you think about it. That's like not how the world used to work. But in liberal democracies, it's true, especially in the ones that are like really, really well advanced, like, for example, Switzerland or Belgium or whatever. Like the prime ministers in these countries, they can't, if they tried to like go rob some stuff, they would be thrown in prison immediately. So it's like really different than like a Turkey or a Cuba, where those people can do whatever the fuck they want. They can arrest thousands and have no accountability. So I think all these differences are real key.
I would kind of disagree with that. Like, I think they all do whatever they want. It's just some actions are more overt and some actions are more covert. So, this is sort of, again, I think the guys in the Sovereign Individual discussed this quite well with, when they sort of place democracy as sort of the better looking brother of, or the better looking sister of communism.
But come on, man. Like the leaders of South Korea are in prison now because they committed crimes. The leader of North Korea would never go to prison. Like, this is a really big difference. I think we would be doing a disservice to the audience to be minimizing that difference. That is a massive difference.
Okay, so how would you then defend things like, the overall tax rate of, a place like California, when you count federal tax and value added tax and all this other bullshit, and you have probably 60, 70, 75% of your money being taken from you. And on the other end, you don't, what do you see for it?
Well, I live in a, yes. Okay, correct. That is a negative trend. However, if I wished, I can just, thankfully, I live in like a country that has a lot of different jurisdictions, which is cool. And if I don't like state income tax, I can literally move to a state that doesn't have any. There are plenty. And those states are going to attract, and they are right now, you're watching like this exodus, right, from certain states in the union to other states. And that's really healthy and that's really good. It's similar in the EU. Like, for example, Portugal has no taxes on Bitcoin, for example. I think that's going to be very good for Portugal in the long term. So people in Germany that don't like those taxes, they could just move. So in both the EU and the US, which are these democratic, like superstructures, they have like different regions. And if you don't like the laws in one, you can move to the other. If you don't like the gun laws in one, you can move to another that's less restrictive or more restrictive, depending on your taste, right? So largely, we have this like union of different states that's been created by different kinds of people with different priorities. And like, you should be able to find a state that is more or less a better fit for you and your lifestyle, which is just so fucking different from in China, where you're basically your birth and your genetics and your religion determine where you can live, right? So that is just such a massive difference. And I
agree.
And that freedom does allow us to prosper,
I know, and I know you keep bringing up China, but I think China is just such a low bar. Like,
but it's the biggest country in the world. Okay, but we'll put China aside. Throw in Russia or North Korea or
they're all low bars.
There's so many of them. It's half the world.
Correct. Well, I'm not here to defend. I guess what I would say quite likely, and someone like Hans Hermann Hoppe has made a very strong case that a lot of these institutions, or a lot of these countries that we're saying are really bad and fucking screwed up and everything, are actually a result of the rise of the democratic state. That they didn't exist 150, 200 years ago. They absolutely didn't exist. That there was a far more fragmented society where if you didn't like somewhere, you could fuck off and move somewhere else. So all of the benefits that you just stated then about sort of these unions of different states and stuff like that actually existed pre-democratic state, but the democratic state enabled the unnatural growth of these super states, which now get to perpetrate what are effectively call it crimes against humanity, which is they get to print all the money they want, they get to tax people into oblivion, they get to drop bombs on innocent people all around the world, they get to fund fucking, you know, World War I, World War II, all this sort of stuff. So they get to do all this sort of stuff. They get to throw people in gulags. So all of this stuff is sort of a side effect of having basically used some of the ingredients of the Enlightenment thinking, but kind of mixed it into some sort of public rule where the representatives have no skin in the game and very little consequences from doing the wrong things.
Sure. I mean, here's where I think the theory versus practice thing is really important, because the Hoppe stuff, I mean, 200, 300 years ago, nobody had human rights. You had to be an aristocrat or a noble to have human rights. Today, it's totally different. And yeah, there's downsides to what has happened in the world, but I mean, inarguably, you'd rather live in a liberal democracy today than a dictatorship. So I guess that's all I'm trying to defend, is that these are the societies on earth today that have the most property rights, the most prosperity, the highest per capita income, the most freedom to do whatever the fuck you want. These are in liberal democracies, not in non-democracies. Hugely important. So if you want to do whatever you want and you want to be an enlightenment person and a sovereign individual, you definitely don't want to live in a monarchy, and you definitely don't want to live in an absolute monarchy or a dictatorship. You want to live in a place probably like Texas or Nevada. I mean, is really where you want to live, and that's in a democracy. So, you know, I'm sure we'll hinge to like the future. We don't know what it's going to look like. But there's one last thing I wanted to cover geopolitically before we move on here, and that's what's called democratic peace theory, which is very interesting to me. And it essentially states that it's an observation that no two liberal democracies have ever fought each other in war, which I think is very important. And you know, people used to say, "Oh no, it's an economic thing. No two countries with McDonald's." And then that got disproven when the U.S. bombed Syria, or sorry, not Syria, Serbia. But liberal democracies have disincentives towards fighting, right? So if you look at France and Germany, there's no way they'd ever go to a hot war right now with each other. But that's really wild to think about, because in a 100-year chunk right before this, you know, chronological period of time, they did go to war 3 times with each other and killed like a third of each other's male population, like in succession. That would never happen now, and that's a result of like a variety of different things. But primarily, I would argue, trade, commerce, and general brotherhood, like planted on this soil of you know, not fascism, of like democracy. So I think democratic peace theory also geopolitically is very important to think about, because ultimately we're all against war. And sure, democracies do horrible shit around the world, like 2 non-democracies. There's no question about that. Look at the invasion of Iraq. But generally speaking, it's been good for the world for like liberal democracies to spread. Tocqueville talks a lot about this in his book, Democracy in America, which is quite good. But you know, he sort of just observes that it's just like less likely that these democracies will fight each other. There's just like a lot of disincentives. Like democratic societies are going to try to find other ways. So I think democratic peace theory is worth ruminating on for a little bit too.
Yeah, I guess. See, and this is something we can't, we may not know, or depending on how the future pans out, we may discover. But it's you know, I'm one area of studies that I think we had the acceleration of technological progress really start to kick off, I think, around the time, like, you know, different people sort of argue about different things, you know, sort of you got industrial revolution. I think it really starts to scale up around the discovery of oil, A, and B, the discovery and implementation of electricity. I think those 2 were 2 of the primary drivers of technological progression. And
birthed by scientific innovation via Enlightenment values would be my argument. But yeah.
Well, birthed by scientific innovation, I actually don't think, you know, the Enlightenment values may have helped in the sense of okay, let's just assume that is the case, both by Enlightenment values. So we needed to start thinking more scientifically, but I guess prior to that, what birthed the Enlightenment values, was, this idea of hereditary rules. So, there's sort of like, it's turtles all the way down, right? So, everything is sort of built on a prior foundation in some way, shape, or form. But the driver there was still economic reality, because the group or the region who could produce more with less became more powerful. Simple as that. Like, and what would end up driving the technological and scientific progression was the fact that you could amass resources better, faster, and more intelligently than could your counterpart during those sort of, I mean, the whole history of humanity has basically been brinkmanship and kind of, securing of territory anyway, right? So that's something that we haven't moved away from. But I actually think in the absence of any form of democracy, even under what would have been monarchic rule prior to the rise of democracy in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, I would argue that we would have had the same amount of technological progression and the same amount of people rising up out of poverty, or probably even more, under anything but a publicly elected set of officials.
And where's the evidence for that? Like, point me to your hard evidence for that, other than theory.
We don't have. I mean, Hong Kong would be the closest to hard evidence, because Hong Kong was not
But Hong
democratic.
Kong had a democracy. It had an assembly.
No,
it had free elections.
No, it didn't have any of that. No,
I had dinner with them. They got to vote, and people voted, and it was not like it is today. Today is no democracy. They fucking came in and stole it all. But they had some. It was not a full, but they had some. They definitely did. They had elections. They had a parliament, and like, you could run and be like very critical of China, and you could sit in the parliament. I've met those people. It's true.
Okay, we'll save that discussion maybe for future. But I again, know people from Hong Kong, and Hong Kong was run very differently than the way we think about general voting and all of that sort of stuff. Like,
sure.
Hong Kong was
the mechanics of voting is something that we could probably debate to me, what I said was that it's the least important part of a democracy is the actual voting process. Hong Kong had these other things underneath that are so important, like free expression and separation of powers. I mean, like, property rights and civil society groups. And then at the top, yeah, it had like this like legislative body that would meet to like just to discuss stuff. It was not a dictatorship. It was not controlled by Beijing. And now it is, and you're going to see the result. You're going to see the outcome. The outcome's not going to be so pretty for the economic output of the place.
Could we agree on this then? It's that the less governance there is, the less anyone meddles, the better it is for individuals within the society.
I mean, at my deepest, yes. But like, you have to unpack that into the world, the messy world that we live in, where we can't have no government, or at least it doesn't, at a bigger scale, doesn't exist. So again, I wanted to bring to this conversation what I've learned from, observing actual societies around the world, as opposed to theory. I think theory helps, but really it's all about practice. It's like Bitcoin. Bitcoin doesn't work in theory, it works in practice. So I don't know. I mean, yes, of course, I agree that individualism is the cornerstone for like prosperity and enlightened humanity. But ultimately, the reality is we got to live in these societies, and we got to figure out some sort of governance. And I guess all I'm saying is that liberal democratic governance has been the best. Perhaps it's the Churchill quote, right? The least bad of all the options. But I wouldn't want to live in any other kind of society. And that's something I wanted to bring up here. You have Hoppe, you have Chomsky. Okay, two of the biggest, what I would say, critics of the democratic model, right? guess what? Hoppe lives in Las Vegas and Chomsky lives in Cambridge. So it's like
Chomsky's an idiot, though. Chomsky's a moron.
Yes,
So
but you
there's a
cannot
big
deny.
difference
Fine,
between the two.
fine, but you cannot deny that he's a very influential critic of the American government. Okay, so is Hoppe. Okay, so they both criticize democracy as we know it. All I'm saying is it's kind of hilarious that they live inside of one and that they're not living in Havana or Moscow. So
yeah, but see, I think the difference there is that an idiot like Chomsky kind of tries to highlight that the communists and everything have a point, whereas Hopper's like, no, those guys are even fucking worse. And Hopper, I think, would agree with you on the idea that democracy is the best that we have at the moment, because we fucking killed off all of the prior monarchs who had some skin in the game in terms of not wanting to blow
I can
each
agree
other up.
with. So where do we go from here?
Yes. Okay. So this is I think where Bitcoin actually changes the game, right? Because
yes,
I've always said something which is the world has to move towards more fragmentation, whether we want to or not. So the only choice we get is that we either do it consciously or the whole thing breaks down and it falls on top of us. So and the reason I say that is this is, the idea of a group coming together and then electing a couple people to say, look, you guys are just in charge of ensuring that some rules or whatever are enforced. That only scales to a certain degree. Like it doesn't scale very well, because the problem is that all individuals are subjective in nature. Like, we all value everything differently. We're all different. Like, the whole point of diversity is that we all, we have different values, we have different needs, we value all sorts of things subjectively. And, in some ways we can, agree on some broad rules, but it doesn't work very well at scale. As much as we've bashed Taleb in recent times, he does a really good saying, which he goes, "I'm a libertarian at the global level. I'm a federalist at the nation level. I'm a socialist at the city level. And I'm
communist
a
at home,
at the family level." Yeah.
Naval says that too. Yeah.
Well, Naval stole it from
right.
Nassim. Yeah. So that, I think, is really interesting. Now I would actually drop his thing even further, which is, I would say, democratic at probably the local level, right? So it's like, I think the idea of democracy sort of scales up to the local level, but anything more than that, what you end up getting is you end up creating a legalized monopoly for theft, basically.
Okay, but there are constraints, whereas there are no constraints to theft in a dictatorship. That's the key. I'm not saying it's the best way. I'm just saying it's the way we can most restrain the theft. Like, there are ways that we can restrain the theft in a democracy. You cannot restrain the theft in a monarchy or in a dictatorship. Just no, it's not happening.
You can absolutely restrain the theft in a monarchy. I think. See the difference. I think. Go on.
Go ahead. No, I was just going to say, like, any mechanism that you can use to restrain theft in a monarchy, you have those tools in a democracy, plus a whole bunch of other ones that you don't have in a monarchy.
Yes and no. So yes, you may have a set of tools. What's interesting, though, and this is where I think a lot, like, monarchy gets a bad rap versus democracy, is that in a monarchic kind of system is you do have skin in the game, and this is, I think, a really important difference between public.
Who's you? What do you mean you?
The ruler, so the monarch has skin in the game.
Sure.
So what it means is they have private land, they have private property, and they have a disincentive from burning through the capital for current cash flow. So, and let me explain this idea fully so that we're we're on the
Can
same
you
page.
please
So,
give a historical example of this, not just a theory? Because I can't really think of very many recent monarchs that have not been completely reckless with the money, but that's okay.
I mean, back in the day, that was their when wars were fought, there was no such thing as total war like what we had in World War I and World War II. So back then, when wars were fought, monarch versus monarch, more often than not, what they would do is they would come up with a deal and they would marry their cousins or some shit so they could create a truce so that they didn't burn through their resources and burn up their land, because they were directly dependent on the lands, the gentry, the peasants, and the nobles in order to subsist. Like
what
they
about
wouldn't go
like
and
the
blow up
100?
the entire
We had
land.
like the 100 Years' War and like the 30 Years' War. I don't know. They just basically they had to
Those,
stop fighting when they ran out of gold, sure, but then they just got more gold and then they paid the guys to kill the other guys. Like, you know.
not entirely, no, because what they did was they went to battlefronts to fight.
Okay.
There was no such thing as, carpet bombing an entire
Well, that's a technological.
nation or
They would have
stuff.
loved to carpet bomb, but they didn't have the technology to do so. I mean, I think that's a
No, not really,
technological difference.
because you have, like, when you've, again, this sort of comes back to the skin in the game difference, is when you're a monarch and you've got property that you want to pass on either to your descendants, or that you've got a set of nobles who are effectively, distributed nodes of governance that, you require the assistance of those in order to go to war. You all of a
Mhm.
sudden have a different set of incentives, and a different set of mechanics in order to mobilize violence and to mobilize force. The
I
democratic
take your point
institution,
and take your
yeah,
point in theory, but dude, the North Korean government has desiccated the country, chopped down all the trees. They've destroyed it completely, and that's a hereditary monarchy. And Saudi Arabia, I mean, fuck, man. I mean, they've done the opposite of trying to make that country more prosperous for the future. They don't even let women drive or vote. I mean, so I just don't think it holds water today. I mean, maybe it did before, but you really didn't have democracies to compare them to. So I don't know, man. I think I disagree on this one.
it's a thought. It's a look. I didn't agree with it many
Yes, it's a
years
thought
ago, but the
experiment for
more
you or me because we don't have to live under an absolute monarchy, but a lot of people do, and it really sucks. And they really wish they had our freedoms. They wish they'd had a fraction of the freedoms that you or I have, a tiny freaking
we,
fraction.
we can't, like, I know you said this in the beginning, is like, I don't think we can compare, say, let's say the German Kaisers, or the Russian royal family with Kim Jong Un and Kim Jong Il and his fucking family, right? There's a different level of hereditary, like, I'll give you an example, maybe just at a purely local level, is, you know, you as a person, you spend your life, trying to improve yourself, and then you have kids and you try to teach them to improve themselves. And over time, you build up, a, uh, a, what am I trying to, generational wealth, right? So, like, when we look at what monarchies originally were, is they emerged from generational wealth being developed and strong values being instilled, in a hereditary fashion. And you sort of had these lands amassed and all these sorts of stuff. Like, it's really interesting if you look at the history of sort of Azerbaijan and, sort of where Iran meets and all this sort of stuff. Like, you have these Khans, these families who have, ruled over areas, hereditarily speaking, but they have these sort of values that are ingrained in terms of the person who's coming in, because they have a duty to extend the family lineage, to protect the lands that they subsist off, and that their nobles and the peasants and everything that are working on subsist off. So there was this sort of, like, if you unnecessarily tried to take someone else's shit or go to war and all this sort of stuff, which, again, notwithstanding the fact that did happen, because you had monarchs and emperors and all this sort of shit with over that were overly ambitious or that, you know, were deranged. Like Nero was a perfect example in Rome. You know, he burnt the whole fucking thing down. Like that's an example of a really bad monarch. Whereas a good monarch, for example, was a Julius Caesar or an Alexander the Great or something like that, right? So they were competent in their escapades.
Sure,
Like,
but again, man, like let's to focus on the future and today. Like we're not like the current map of again. I don't constitutional monarchies do not count. Those are democracies. Spain is not a monarchy. Neither is the United Kingdom or Canada or Australia. Those are the king does not or the queen does not just rule arbitrarily. It's democracy. If you actually look at the actual monarchies, you have like Morocco, which is fucking enslaving Western Sahara. You have Saudi Arabia, which is unspeakably bad. Oman, also a disaster. And then you have the slave states of the Gulf, like the Emirates, for example, which are built on complete slavery. And then you have Jordan, which is probably the best of the bunch. But still, if you disagree with the king, you go to prison. And then you have these like little tiny ones in Europe, like Liechtenstein, but those are more like city states. There just is not a lot of, and then there's other like ones that I would argue are monarchies based on the fact that it's like father, son, father, son, father, son. And that's like a North Korea or like a Cuba, maybe. Those are all dumpster fires too. So if we're going to go forward in human nature and be progressive and seek innovation and go to the stars and secure our individual sovereignties and stuff, like the last place on earth you'd want to be today is inside of a monarchy. That's my argument based on where we are in 2021.
I guess I'll take that on board. My final point about monarchies is that I think had we not killed off all the primary monarchies in the early 1900s, particularly with the end of the 1800s and the early 1900s, I actually think technological progress would have taken us a hell of a lot further because there's natural constraints.
I'll also admit I'm hugely biased. I'm an American. We take particular pride in overthrowing the king, you know, and starting our own country. So maybe I'm just very biased. But that's
perhaps. Look, I love American history as well. Trust me, I think it's an incredible thing, and I think the American implementation of, you know, it's democracy. It's only sort of catching up now. You know what I mean? Like the early America, which is really what made America, was not really a democracy. It was the fucking wild, wild west, and I think that's what made America great in the first place. You know, it was sort of those Enlightenment values initially.
Only possible because we didn't have a king, because we didn't have an arbitrary ruler, and that's what we fought for. You know. But just to, because I know we want to move to the future, so I wanted to bring up this as a transition piece. And look, we can like safe and we can keep having these conversations about monarchy. I welcome them. But like when you think about the future and you think about Bitcoin, I do think it's just worth pointing out before we get into it that you know, look, there were two ways to secure our freedom in the digital future. One was to beg the governments to give us the freedoms, and one was to take it with open source code, right? So you go back to the cypherpunks, who, you know, clearly the majority of them were living in democracies. So, you know, the political soil for both Bitcoin and what is now the implementation of stuff like Signal through open source cryptography, people like Moxie Marlinspike making Signal and whoever Satoshi was making Bitcoin most likely came from whether it was the United States or Europe or Japan, probably a liberal democracy. You know, that was the political soil that these things get invented in. So that's like another, I think, a pretty interesting argument for liberal democracies is that like arguably the most important bulwarks against the surveillance state and Orwellian societies of the future were born inside liberal democracies, not dictatorships. And that's just another credit to them, I would say.
I mean, I think technological innovation emerges. I actually don't think that was because of the democratic thing. It's just because the technological evolution started in the sort of English language and in the West. So I think Bitcoin is a function of that, not so much the political environment that it was in, right? So it was it emerged on the internet, which is, I think, a
food for
totally
thought.
different thing.
Food for thought.
Yeah. It's
because I would argue, yes, the West, which was built on Enlightenment values, and are all democracies. But yeah. Anyway, to get to Bitcoin, look, man, I think now is different. We've covered throughout this entire conversation the sort of legacy world, like the world up till 2010-ish, or really 2015-ish. Now we have real property rights. To me, Bitcoin is the only actual property right that you don't have to ask somebody to help you protect, or you don't have to trust an institution to protect it for you. With your house, or your deed to whatever, or your car, or God knows, even your intellectual property in the public domain, all that shit is like, you have to trust somebody else to help you protect it. Your private key to your Bitcoin is fucking yours. And that is so powerful for people around the world, especially those who don't live in liberal democracies and don't have a court system that can protect their shit. So that's why I'm so jazzed about Bitcoin.
Okay, so then tell me, what does that then do to I think we can make an assumption of what it does to places that are more tyrannical in nature. What do you think it does to places that are like that are traditionally, I guess, shadows of the liberal democracy?
Yeah, and look, we can look at the we can take a page from these folks, from these fine folks, and I think we can start thinking about this like competitive world where, and I know it always sounds utopian and idealistic, but like I feel like we're starting to see it, like the world where like jurisdictions actually compete for people. And I mentioned this before in the show, but like today things are like where they are, but like in 5 years, moving to Portugal because it has no taxes on Bitcoin is going to be a very interesting idea. I mean, it's a nice place. It's chill. Why not? So I think like these different jurisdictions are going to be able to lure talented people, to them with different, with their rules and regulations about Bitcoin. And I think like, obviously, like these are going to be open societies because you're not going to move to a dictatorship because you're not going to have no assurances that they're not going to just come take your shit. So I think that's what you're seeing. The mayor of Miami and Florida, he's like trying to like encourage like, all the people to come start up the new Silicon Valley of Bitcoin there. You're seeing mining being encouraged in Kentucky. I don't know. I think that like democracies will sort of adapt. What's kind of a neat feature of democracies is like we already have Bitcoiners at the highest level of the US government. So we have a Bitcoiner on the Senate Banking Committee, a hardcore Bitcoiner. I mean, Cynthia Loomis said that she came for the store of value and stayed for the censorship resistance. And the guy who's going to be our SEC chair wrote a book on Bitcoin, and Hester Pierce, who's in charge of a lot of this stuff too, she just wrote something the other day about how like we gotta be pro innovation and we can't like really be like Luddite about this stuff. So I think the climate in democracies, especially in America, at least right now, seems positive, as opposed to like authoritarian places like certainly Nigeria or India is now sort of being downgraded into an authoritarian state, essentially, sadly. And both of those countries are trying to like fucking prevent their citizens by law from buying Bitcoin. So it's not going to work. True. But that sucks, man.
So what do you think happens to these the layers of institution inside the democratic states when a lot of their raison d'etre in the first place simultaneously ceases to exist, but the traditional tax revenue and Cantillon effect from inflation that they were getting ceases to exist as well simultaneously?
I have a utopian view and then a more realistic view. I mean, the utopian view would be that over time, that as we enter like the Bitcoin age, basically, and what will happen inevitably is the governments will start accumulating Bitcoin as treasury assets, and they're going to be a lot more restrained in what they can do. I mean, they're going to be very much more reliant on their populations who hold the Bitcoin. And they're going to have to ask for permission to do shit rather than like go bomb stuff in the Middle East without our permission, because they just won't have the money to do it. That's like the utopian view, is that like Bitcoin helps all societies, but especially the ones that can change the fastest, the democracies, towards being just more peaceful and more kind of conservative in terms of like what they do. they won't have the money to do social engineering or all this crazy stuff. They'll have to kind of like be a little more careful. That's the more realistic vision, but rather the more utopian vision. But the realistic part of me knows that there's going to be a lot of tough times in there, because we have these social welfare programs in democracies that are not affordable, but do great good, like on an individual level. There's no question. Like my father, for example, before he passed away, he was able to have a surgery that would have cost him $40,000, and he wouldn't have been able to afford it, but he got it paid by the state, and he was able to survive longer. So there's a lot of that undergirds Western societies right now that I think will have to be sort of cut back or whatever. And I know it's going to be messy. It's not going to be perfect, but I do think some of the bigger arcing trends are towards probably less war, less extravagant social expenditures, and more of a like governments have to kind of really understand their people and talk to them, as opposed to just doing shit without their permission. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, so 2 points that I'll quickly make, and we can dig into each of them. So before, what I was talking about, like the trend towards fragmentation being something that's going to happen whether we choose it or not, is as something gets larger, particularly anything that is tried, any complex system that you try and control from the center, as it grows, it becomes more fragile, right? So what we're seeing today in these large scale nation states that are whatever, democratic in nature or camouflaged communism, whatever the fuck we're going to call them, right? The problem with them is that in order for them to subsist, they have to continually print more money. They have to continually tax people more. They're stuck in a double bind, right? They actually can't get out of that. So they have to keep stealing from the future in order to fund what's effectively a bankrupt business model. Like the West is completely bankrupt, whether it's America, whether it's Germany, like all of it. The dictatorships and all of them, they're not only financially bankrupt, they're morally bankrupt and all of that. Now, the West is just completely financially bankrupt.
Okay.
And that's a big problem, because that's purely a function of having a monopoly on the capacity to print money, having a monopoly on violence, having a monopoly on the ability to decree what is and what isn't ethical or moral. In other words, laws. So when you do that, you end up putting yourself in a position where you can run a bankrupt institution, and the consequences are basically socialized. So you, me, and everybody else, we pay for the mistakes that the so-called elected officials who win popularity contests, that they make, because they don't have to pay for that themselves. Like they don't have, this is sort of the skin in the game problem. So what we've done is, over the last 100 years, is we've indebted every future generation more and more and more and more. And we have more debt than we could ever hope to fucking pay back. And debt is basically a promise on the future, right? So it's a promise on the productive capacity of the future. So we're sort of stealing from our children to pay for our extravagance today. And this thing is something that, like, this is sort of the denial of gravity, right? It's democracy's church moment, right? It's democracy's moment prior to the Enlightenment. So sort of Bitcoin brings the economic enlightenment to the world, and sort of shows the existing financial system and the existing democratic system that it is not functional at scale, that it is a bankrupt institution, and that it can't continue to do this at scale. So the ramifications of that are going to be, again, even without Bitcoin in the picture, is that this thing at some stage falls apart. So I was kind of getting myself lost there for a second. So
it's okay.
So fragmentation is the final goal, because we can't just keep stealing from the future. We'll end up at a point where we don't have anything to fucking steal.
What do you mean fragmentation? Do you mean like big states going kind of more local, or what?
Yeah, like the EU falling apart, the United States saying fuck the United States, we're going to be the digital, like all sorts of stuff breaking up because it has to, right? Because you can't govern at scale. Like it's just like I mean, if the 2020 elections did anything, it just showed that there's two Americas, right?
Right. I guess my thoughts would be, again, sort of halfway between my utopian and realistic viewpoints here. I do think that there's like going to be this sort of alignment that as we go on into the Bitcoin age, and it will be the gradually then suddenly thing, but that's going to happen like many times over the next several decades. I think that like our, at least when I say our, I mean sort of American style democracies will be brought more tightly into alignment between the representatives who are supposedly making decisions about us and us, because they will necessarily have to, because they will need the money that we have to do shit. So I do think that it could actually help make democracies better. Actually, number one is like one thought I had, and it's going to make dictatorships a real issue. I mean, I just don't know how they're going to get the money to do what they want to do. So that's going to be a big problem for them. And these are largely the reasons why I'm really excited about Bitcoin.
Let's pull on a couple threads there. So
sure.
I think that the fragmentation being the end state because it has to be the end state, like nature functions in a fragmented fashion.
How does your fragmentation theory work with the geopolitics of Bitcoin mining? I mean, it doesn't seem like we're going to head towards a thing where like there's like thousands of different sovereign Bitcoin miners. It looks like it's rather going to centralize into like maybe a couple dozen large entities spread across a couple different countries. So how does that vibe with fragmentation theory?
No, I think as we go, jurisdictions that will want to that have the capacity to produce power, because it isn't only a couple places that can produce power. There's going to be multiple.
There's many. There's
ways
dozens.
That we can produce power. Bitcoin mining operations will coalesce around those.
Okay.
That's what I think will happen, and whether that becomes, whether that is nuclear, geothermal, solar, wind, the oil, gas, like whatever it's going to be, it'll Bitcoin will end up mining operations will end up basically sitting right next to where all the energy production is. I think so. So I think over time it'll decentralize more and more and more, as opposed to Volcano decentralized. But because I mean, at the end of the day, Bitcoin's an energetic beast. It is going to go to the source, and the world cannot function on a centralized energy source. The energy will have to decentralize just through the sheer force of reality. Is that the more, like, again, this sort of comes back to the fragility of large systems. Is large systems, that the larger they get, the more they have dependencies inside them that when they break, you have catastrophic failure across the whole thing. Whereas localized, fragmented infrastructure has interdependency, which is different than straight dependency across the whole system. So if one thing breaks, and the Bitcoin infrastructure itself is a perfect example of this, right? So it's like if one thing goes down, the whole thing doesn't fall over, right?
To play to your point, let's take the case of Portugal, for example, and we don't know when this is going to happen, but like it seems reasonable that a country that is not going to tax its citizens in Bitcoin is quite Bitcoin friendly. What if Portugal decides within the span of 12 months in 2024 to both adopt, and maybe it could happen sooner than this, but both to start to basically they convert a lot of their reserve to Bitcoin, and they declare independence from the EU, and their currency becomes like very strong relative to other currencies, and they attract a massive amount of intellectual and creative talent, and they basically become a South Korea type powerhouse. I mean, do you see that sort of thing happening?
I think so, but I don't think it'll happen at the scale of Portugal. I think it'll happen at smaller scales.
It's like city states, basically.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So this sort of ties into my second thesis. So you got the fragmentation thesis, then you have what I call the move from overlord subject relationship to customer service provider relationship.
Okay,
right?
I'm into that.
Because and this kind of ties into what you were sort of saying earlier, is at the moment our relationship with elected officials is a overlord subject relationship. Even in the liberal democracies, like if you genuinely, you can potentially move out, but you have a massive exit tax, for example.
Well, they have
in the US,
term
right?
limits. They have term limits, and there's rules on what they can do. But yes, you're right. They get to make the decisions. Correct.
So there is still, like, we still don't have a we don't have a customer service provider relationship anywhere in the world. It just doesn't exist at the moment. And this is sort of where I think the Bitcoin Renaissance comes in.
Just to add color to that, in America, at least, I don't know how it is in Germany or Japan or Australia, but we have this thing called pork, right? So like the congressmen and women across our country, every time we have a bill, they force in shit that their constituents want, right? Because they need to get elected. So actually, there is more of this than maybe meets the eye. Like there's a ton of like local bullshit that gets pulled into federal politics because people want to get elected and they want to seem popular. So they actually go around and they listen. Hi, what do you want? What do you want? What do you want? And they realize, oh man, I live in a place that has a lot of corn. Therefore, I'm going to go like do some policies that are corn favorable. Therefore, I'm going to get elected again. So it is not so much of it is not just an overlord. It is a little bit of the customer client thing. There is a little bit of that in America, at least. Do you see what I'm saying?
A little bit. Yeah. Okay, fine. Maybe
more so than North Korea. Let's put it that way.
Fair. Okay. That's 100% I agree with. Definitely not at the individual level, right? You don't have any say in it.
No.
Exactly. So it's maybe at the corporation level or something like that. But that's sort
level.
of, I think, local level. I guess so. Yeah. So I actually, so one of these one of the ramifications of this, both the fragmentation, the force of fragmentation, and also the transformation from overlord subject to customer service provider, is that in order to effectively provide the service provider is going to have to become way more efficient. And in order to become more efficient, they're going to have to get way smaller. And this is where I think this, the case for city states and the case for the complete fragmentation of Europe, of America, of all this sort of stuff starts to take hold, is that in the absence of being able to print money and in the absence of being able to enforce taxation, which they can do now, they can't do it on Bitcoin. They completely lose the capacity to run large-scale governance. It just doesn't work because it's a bankrupt thing. You can't get the money from anywhere.
Okay, so let's say that the future is in this, like, and maybe I agree that like at least the far future is in this sort of more like snow crash-esque kind of city-state type structure. Where does it go wrong? Like, what are you afraid of as we go into the Bitcoin age? Like, what do you think? I mean, it can't all be good, right? So what do you actually think is going to be like sad or like tragic?
Yeah, I wrote an article a while ago called "Libertarians Are Not Utopians, We're Realists." And what I tried to delineate is when we talk about these sort of city states and all this sort of stuff, fragmentation, decentralization, localism, it's sort of, I think people misunderstand that and they think that we're being utopian. And that's definitely not what I'm being. What I'm saying is that we actually make society more meritocratic. So if I was to sort of think about a functional, like what the future of society might look like, I would actually say that I made up a term the other day and I'm sort of calling it meritocratic feudalism. So I think we will, because at the moment, like despite having, democracies or communism or whatever, version of collectivism we have at the moment, it is still just a different flavor of feudalism, right? So if you are in the political elite, you've got a certain set of things you can do. If you're in the corporate elite, you've got a certain set of
but
things.
It's different though, because you can be dirt poor and then become in the political elite.
Correct.
You couldn't do that before.
You have some mobility, right? So traditional feudalism the difference between modern feudalism, I think, and traditional feudalism was that there was no mobility, right? Today, there's a little bit more mobility. Whereas what
Yeah.
I kind of view in the future is what I'm trying to term meritocratic feudalism, is that you will have unlimited mobility. But if you're really smart and if you're really capable, and if if you add more value to society, and if you grow your family and you teach them to add more value to society, you will be able to continually amass wealth. And I actually think we're going to get a new version of monarchies, like a new version of feudalism, but where you can't stay at the top through some sort of parasitic means, where you have downside risk that is real, because you can't clip coins, you can't print money, you can't tax others, you can't do all that sort of shit,
Right.
because the money has been demonopolized and ripped out of your hands, right? So if you have, for example, a generation or two of completely incompetent fools as sons and grandchildren, and they completely squander all of the generational wealth you built, for example, your so-called kingdom or little empire that you've spent your entire life building is going to fall apart, because you don't have the capacity through political or monetary means to maintain your position in the strata.
If you're telling me that, and again, there'll be many different kinds of governance structures, both at the city-state level, and assuming that nation states at least survive for the Westphalia thing survives for probably at least another few decades, or at least commingles with these city-states. If you're telling me that those leaders are going to have to be less wasteful and more concerned about the quality of life in their country because of Bitcoin, then that sounds pretty exciting to me,
It's super exciting. So then to your second point is like, what am I worried about?
Yeah.
I'm less worried about, sort of when we're sort of in a world of hyper Bitcoinization. I was talking to NVK about this, and we were sort of saying like,
shout out to NVK.
Bitcoin, he's a fucking legend. On a Bitcoin standard, you have something really interesting that happens, and then I'll talk about where my real concern is, which is along the way, because I think that's the concern. But in a future where we sort of, we're on a Bitcoin standard and all that sort of stuff, it's not utopian, because it's going to have its own problems. You can't remove the stupidity from humanity, and you can't remove the inevitable entitlement that you get being born into affluence. So that sort of ties into the cycles of humanity, which is, good men create good times create weak men create bad times. You've heard that a million times, right?
Yeah.
So when you sort of grow up into affluence, you sort of have this tendency to be less driven. You have this tendency to sort of be more entitled in behavior. Now, that is not always true, but there is a tendency towards that. And that's why when natural systems are quite dynamic, is that, you have a couple generations of wealth, and it ends up redistributing itself back into the system, because at some point, you have a delinquent generation that, takes hold of the family heirlooms, and they fucking burn them all, right? So anyway, coming back to the future is, we will have problems, but on a Bitcoin standard, because you've only got two ways to basically accrue wealth, is you add value or you steal it, versus the reality of today, you have three ways to accrue wealth. You add value, you steal it, or you get into governmental banking, in which case you basically steal it covertly, right? Is you tax or you inflate. So in the absence of the third one, you end up getting these sort of forces of upward mobility in terms of the creation of wealth, which is you're incentivized to do good, because stealing actually becomes quite hard, particularly when private property is information, and I can have my private keys in my head. The cost of attacking is much higher than the cost of defending. Right. So you end up sort of being channeled towards wanting to add some value and being competent in order to get ahead, right?
Right. I think we're also, it's worth not skipping over whether or not Bitcoin acts kind of as like this restraining force on economies, or whether it is the whole thing. Because at least I believe that there's still, of course, to me, going to be lots of credit, and people will issue debt, and you'll be able to invest in my endeavors and things like that. And these things will not be, they might be Bitcoin denominated, but they won't be Bitcoin. They'll be like promissory notes, or you have this many shares in my thing, and there's going to be a lot of that still. So there won't be zero. I guess all I'm saying is there won't be zero capacity for bullshit around, like, printing more stuff, right?
Absolutely not. So that's all peripheral, and that will all happen.
Right.
The difference is it'll correct sooner, right? So it won't bubble and correct. Is that bad decisions will reveal themselves.
There'll be no more like
sooner.
zombie companies will be very difficult.
Correct.
Too. Yeah.
Correct. Exactly.
Yeah. So
you don't sort of diverge
I agree
from reality
completely.
so much.
And I would say that zombie companies are very similar to zombie governments. I mean, these governments that don't provide value to the world, that only hold on to power through violence and through like control. That's not going to go so well in the Bitcoin age. So
it won't go so well because it can't go so well. Exactly, right? So because you can't be close enough to the monetary spigot to maintain your position as a result of being a beneficiary of the Cantillon effect. So in the absence of that, you actually end up having, basically, you have real downward risk. You can actually fall if you make bad decisions.
I'm with you here. So let's say we get this fragmented city-state thing in the future. I mean, are you saying that you think it's going to be kind of like, have you seen that show Altered Carbon on Netflix?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Are you saying it's going to be kind of like that, where you have this like class of like sort of superhuman type people, not natural, supernatural, but like very wealthy, or do you not think it couldn't it be some sort of like council of people that are somewhat elected? I mean, what are your thoughts? I mean, how couldn't it maybe be both or either, or what?
Okay, I have some thoughts on that. Let me just finish the prior train of thought.
Sure,
quickly.
Go ahead.
So you have this forcing function of incentives that make people strive to do better. Yes. But on the downside, so this is where people sort of get confused when they think about how capitalism works and monopolies and all this sort of stuff, is that as rich are getting richer on Bitcoin, like if you keep making good decisions, you're going to amass more wealth, right? So that's normal. But on the downside is, unlike in today's society, where if you make a bad decision, or even sometimes you make a good decision, and through taxation or theft or whatever, dictatorships or democratic fuck ups or whatever, you lose. You don't sort of spiral downwards. Bitcoin actually corrects you very quickly. So if you make a bad move, you lose very quickly. There is no social safety net for you to lie to yourself in the losing process. So the downward spiral is actually buffered really quickly, and it's transformed into an upward spiral because the disincentive is immediate. So I guess what I'm trying to talk about there is that we're not going to live in some utopian future. We're always going to make mistakes. We're always going to fuck up. We're always going to do those things. Yeah. But the fuck ups will be revealed much quicker.
They'll be more costly.
We don't create exactly, but they'll be more initially costly, so that they don't become catastrophically costly later.
Yeah.
And I think that's just a really important.
Yeah, it'll be harder to like hide waste, basically.
Exactly. Yeah. So you can't hide tail risk to the point where it blows everything up. So you get an earlier corrective mechanism, basically.
I mean, seems to make sense. So again, so in our whole debate about like, these sort of representative democracy structures, which I've been, boosting the whole time, versus some sort of, more kind of monarchical or at least like oligarchical type structures. I mean, what do you think these city-states are going to look like?
I think you get the rise of the nobles, the rise of people who have consistently made good decisions, economically speaking, socially speaking, that they've built good relationships, almost like a digital futuristic version of what Hong Kong was. So there might be a council, there might be, your elders and your wise people and all that sort of stuff who've emerged as good stewards, who've sort of, or even like sort of the early Venetian and Florentine families, right? That there was nobles in those periods who they funded artists, they funded science, they funded all this sort of stuff as as these sort of projects for the flourishing of what's going on around them, right? So I think we sort of get the rise of the noble class again, as opposed to the elected official. And the noble class is one that doesn't get elected through some broad-based voting, but by virtue of having made good social and economic calculations along the way, so that they've got good relationships with people that also have good relationships with people that have their that have impact on industry, that have impact on productivity and all this sort of stuff. So I think that is sort of where we move now. If you're a dick in that environment, you can't remain in the environment because you don't have your finger on the printer. And that is where I think Bitcoin changes the game fundamentally.
Yeah. So here's the thing I would add is that, like, yes, I think that, like, quite obviously people who have like significant Bitcoin, and like, honestly, in that future, we're talking honestly anything more than like a 1/10 of a Bitcoin, I think is going to be a big fucking deal. But those people, here's the thing, they don't necessarily want to govern. Like, politics sucks. So this is where that kind of council, and I believe it won't necessarily be based extensively on necessarily only on meritocracy, but like the people, most people don't want to govern. They want to like go to Mars and do cool shit and like work in business or art or whatever. So I still think they will continue to elect people to serve on their behalf, and there'll be maybe a short leash, but I still think it's going to have some of that, sort of multi-party politics stuff. There's going to be lobbying. There's going to be people. We're still going to be arguing about guns and abortion for sure. In 100 years, for sure, we'll be arguing about the abortion thing till the end of time. So it's like, there's still going to be these like deep-seated issues that people disagree on. There's going to be different parties. Yes, it may be more local and kind of city-state-ish, but I don't necessarily see this liberal democracy thing going away. And if anything, what I see is that the Bitcoin giving real property rights basically just like puts more restraints against what the state can do and kind of forces it more into alignment with individuals, provided we can keep the technological pace of adoption up so that citizens can continue to hold their own Bitcoin easily and run nodes where they need to. And that seems to be the freaking track that we're on, man. Like, it's so much easier to do those things now than it was 5 years ago. So it has me pretty inspired that we can get there.
Okay, what if I decided to buy a major parcel of land, let's say in the Balkans in Europe, which is bankrupt, and I decide to buy a big parcel of land there, and I say, okay, I'm going to build something here which is a private city, and we're not going to have elected officials, but what we'll have is a free market for protection. So a free market for the protection of your house, so like security guards and all that sort of stuff, and you can choose whichever entity you want to do that. We'll have a free market for judicial services. We'll have a free market for, I don't know, a couple of those basic things. And then next door you have another city which says, look, at our city you can come and live here, and it's a membership fee. So we don't charge any taxes, but it's a membership fee. You pay the membership fee either on a monthly basis, like as a service, as a software, city as a software, software as a city as a service, for fuck's sake. Or at the end of the year. And we provide these basic, components of, no one's going to rob you. And if someone robs you, you've got liability insurance where we'll pay, anything that's been robbed. So I think, what ends up happening is, instead of, elected officialdom, that sort of stuff sort of falls by the wayside because you don't need it as much when these better methods start to compete with each
who's
other.
gonna make the fucking decisions? I mean, the guy who's rich enough to go buy a giant piece of land, he's not gonna want to make the decisions, or she's not gonna want to make the decisions. They're gonna want to hire someone else to do it. So I guess what I'm saying is, like, we inevitably get back to this idea of representative governance, because if you are a massive Bitcoin holder in the future, whatever term we're going to use for that kind of person, I feel like that person is going to want to pursue personal creative arts and cook and be with their family and hunt or do what they want to do. I don't think they're going to want to deal with like the sort of accounting of the city and all that bullshit. So I think they're going to want to, like, now you're going to say, oh, they're going to appoint them. Well, eventually that person's going to die, and then there's going to be a crisis of governance. And then I just think this is, it's difficult to lose the track we're on of the people being able to have a say over who governs them. I just think that's kind of the base thing that I believe in.
I think it'll move from
especially with
electing
Bitcoin
to hiring. It'll move from electing though to hiring.
Okay, maybe that's fair. I mean, it's not that different. There are votes. We have this very flawed way of choosing our rulers, but I mean, there could be other ways. But the point is, like, what's exciting is that, like, it is like, let's say you have these little city states, right, snow crash style or whatever, and there's not going to be Hong Kong bucks, right? It'll be Bitcoin. And like, if you know, as long as people can have access to that, then they can move. They can go to the other city if they want to. So that's the key: is can we ensure? Can we keep fighting for Bitcoin to make it as decentralized as possible, make it as easy as possible to own and hold, so that, like, in the future people don't get trapped in that, like, fiat pit? Because, like, there will be those city states where, like, only some people have Bitcoin, everybody else doesn't, and then that's going to be really fucking shitty. So you really have to, like, that's what I would be fighting for. My future self 50 years from now, I envision, would be like trying to help, like, more people get access to Bitcoin or whatever. So
the transition is going to be super fucking messy. There's gonna be people who are jealous about Bitcoin holders. There's going to be people who, you know, come up with all sorts of fucking good and shit ideas along the way. I have no idea what the transition is going to look like. I have more of an idea of, I think, what the not the end state, because there's no such thing as an end state, but what a more hyper Bitcoinized state would look like. Because I think one of the other things you mentioned there about, like, elected officials is the number of elected officials will diminish significantly, because there's going to be so much less to govern. One of the reasons we have so many elected officials and so much layers is because we try to govern everything in the current framework of society. Whereas I think in the future, there'll be so little to govern that these again, mixing the less to govern with smaller jurisdictions, you're not going to need to do these large scale fucking votings and all this sort of shit. Like, I think all of that sort of stuff goes by the wayside. And that's where these city states and the services that the states provide will function more like a customer and service provider relationship, where you can just pay for whatever the fuck you want to have where you live. And that is a far more functional thing. You don't have to then deal with, like, this actually touches to the last point that I want to discuss here, which is about voting, because your vote then transforms from being a vote on a piece of paper on a ballot for somebody, and your vote actually goes to the raw meaning of what a vote means, which is you pay for that which you want, and you do not pay for that which you don't want. So literally, when I think about voting, I think the only vote that counts is your economic vote. So when you go to the shopping center and you buy meat, a steak instead of broccoli, you have voted for steak being more important for you than broccoli, as opposed to a group of you getting together.
Obviously, I get it, but, like, the whole point of democracy is that, like, we got to give people who aren't as rich as others some sort of influence and voice. Otherwise, the whole thing gets corrupted. So
no,
that's the whole point.
It actually doesn't. This is maybe where we disagree.
Yeah, like, obviously, if you don't have that, it turns into a fucking dictatorship, and then that sucks for everybody. So, I mean, liberal democracies, I've tried to make the point through this conversation that liberal democracies perform the best on every possible metric, including if you want to just like do your own thing and build your citadel. Yeah, you can do that in Nevada or Texas. You can't do that in China or in North Korea or in Saudi Arabia. You can't just do whatever you want. So down to like however free you want to be, like liberal democracy is the best political soil for that. And it has these features whereby even the most downtrodden and vulnerable among us, even if we don't agree or have capital to do certain things, still can like have rights. That's like the real amazing part of it. And I don't think that's going to go away in this future world. In fact, I guess what I'm arguing is that I think that in a weird way, Bitcoin, I think will probably restrain governments from doing excess things because they won't be able to afford it. So
yeah, the voting thing is interesting. So do you think
and remember, just so we don't get hung up on the voting, voting to me is like the very kind of top layer of a democracy. It's not the important foundation and the underneath stuff. Like again, Hitler got elected, so does Kim Jong-un. He has an election every time just with his name on it. So the voting itself, whatever, man, it's a mechanism. The point is that the leaders change like this. That's the key. Can't have somebody be in power forever.
I think by removing leaders and removing voting altogether, we're going to be better. But let me just dig into voting here. So would you agree that voting should be weighted to I'm trying to think of an analogy here. When let's say you want to go into a store and you want to buy a sofa, okay, and you're the person buying the sofa, right, and you like orange, right, and you want to buy an orange sofa, but you have a friend that always visits your house, and he likes red sofas.
Okay.
Now he's not buying the sofa, but he has an equal say in terms of what color sofa you should buy. Now he brings along a second friend who also comes and stays at your place, and he also likes red sofas. So now they both like red, you like orange, you're paying for it, but they're not paying for it, but because they also get to stay at your place, they get to make the decision on the color of the sofa that's being purchased. Does that make any sense?
I see what you're getting at, but I don't know. I don't think that would happen in real life. No, I don't. Why would you agree to let your friends decide if you're the one paying?
Correct, but I think that does actually happen in real life in the way taxation is distributed. Is I'm forcibly, like, for me, I don't use public hospitals. I don't use.
I get it where you're going. This is big stuff.
Right?
But again, you got to remember. Let's go back to the original conversation. There is no utopia. You can't just like go and like not pay taxes. Like you can either have like a country where you can have an influence and you can like push for reform and you can like lead a movement to change the way taxation works, or you can live in China where they control your capital controls and you do what they fucking say, and that's it. Those are the choices in the world today. That's it.
Or you build Bitcoin, and you eliminate taxation altogether.
I still think we're going to live in a social contract where like you're not going to want to pave the roads or do the police, and you're going to want to hire someone to do that, and that's going to be this like group of people who you pay to do that, and you collectively pay them to do that.
Service.
Yeah, we'll get closer to that. We'll get closer to that. That's ultimately what
Yeah, it starts to look more like paying for insurance and paying for products and services. So I guess this is where I wanted to sort of pull on what you said earlier about like poor people or people without resources getting a say. So I actually believe, so let's assume that one of these imaginary jurisdictions does have, let's say, some form of tax, which is you pay a flat rate of 10% on all of your earnings to be a part of this thing. Now, I think what would be fair is that if you're living in that society, the weighting of your vote should be determined by how much overall tax you pay.
Okay.
And now this is consistent with the example that I gave about the orange couch versus the red couch. Is, what we've done with voting, which I think is really, really bad, is that we've given people with no skin in the game the same say as somebody with much more skin in the game. And I think this changes in a Bitcoin system is, and this is where I think the logical conclusion to the elimination of all voting happens, is when you have a greater say because you have more skin in the game, or you've provided more, which is, for example, if you live in this city and you're paying $1 million a year, and somebody's paying, 1 million satoshis a year, and somebody else is paying,
Yeah.
10,000 satoshis, you should get 100 times the say that he does in terms of the decision making for where that
I don't know.
stuff should
I
go.
mean, I see the point. I get the point. But, what that allows is an anti-meritocratic system where you have people who've inherited wealth and are totally fucking useless, and they have a lot of Bitcoin and they get to have all the power. I don't think so, man. So I'm not going to fight for that way. I just don't.
No, but what happens when somebody with who pays a larger amount does that, but then decides to be a dick about it? What's the natural consequence? What's the natural corrective mechanism?
Today, very little. I mean, they get to eventually they'll
today very little.
Decisions.
I'm talking in Bitcoin. What's the natural consequence of
well,
having more but making poor decisions?
So you think it'll lead to squander faster? Basically, you think
100%. You can't stay there. You can't stay there. Because
so
if
you think they'll just sort of
they'll
just spend away their influence very quickly.
Fuck yeah, absolutely.
All right. That's maybe
the natural corrective mechanism. That's the natural corrective mechanism.
I still think to avoid it, again, we live in a very nuanced world that's gray and not black and white, and I still think that it's worth having people, regardless of the occupation they choose or whatever, to have some sort of influence over their rulers. And I can't tell you what that's going to look like in the Bitcoin future because we just don't know. But I do think it is promising that individuals, in terms of what we're watching today, is that individuals can take power into their own hands, and they can save against devaluation, and they can transmit money without asking permission, and they can do global commerce without oversight of authorities. And this is starting to happen, right? And it's a really necessary check against excess, hyperinflation and capital controls and all this nonsense. So you're watching happen. I just think it's going in a direction where we're going to end up having more advanced, less wasteful, more efficient versions of liberal democracies. And I guess you think it's going to be more like these kind of futuristic monarchies, and I guess that's cool. I mean, maybe it'll be one or the other. We don't know,
I think it'll be a mixture of them, but I really want to just sort of leave you with some food for thought there around, particularly because again, my contention on voting, for example, being weighted actually has a logical conclusion of voting being completely abolished in any sense, and everything sort of coming down to whoever pays for what they want to pay for, they get what they get. And then you have basically, if we look at poverty, so if you've got a person who is in a position of poverty, in order for them to get out of poverty, the most functional way for them to do that is to be able to perform work and save the excess product of their labor, right? So you need a mechanism for savings, and you need somewhere to work. Now, the place that poor person is going to work is going to be for someone who has excess capital, in order to require a product or service, right? So you actually need someone more wealthy, and you need someone more poverty stricken in order for there to be some sort of relationship there for the person who is poverty stricken to rise up.
Okay, so how does this have to do with voting?
Right. So this is what it's got to do with voting. So you mentioned before is this idea that somebody who doesn't have resources also having a say with respect to voting, right?
Yes.
And my position on that being that it's a bad idea, because you start to give people with no skin in the game a say, and those people are naturally going to, if I've got the same say as somebody who's adding value into society, I don't have the incentive to want to lift myself out of poverty in the same way as if I didn't have a say. Now, if I didn't have like, so if, and this is where the corrective mechanism comes in, is the person who does have a say, or who has more of a say, like where it's weighted, if he's dictates or mandates or suggestions or whatever it might be, or suggestions on how resources should be allocated, negate my existence, I am going to flee, I'm going to leave, I'm going to go somewhere else. I'm not going to be there anymore. I'm not going to be able to provide him a service. So it's a detriment to him and it's a detriment to me. So what you get is by creating a situation where the vote is weighted, you end up.
I just don't think not everything's about the money you have though. Like if you're wealthy, you can like figure out ways to like enjoy yourself and figure like the US has the 15th and 19th Amendment to the Constitution because basically people tried to prevent like Black people and women to not vote because it made them more powerful, and that was fucked up. And there was no way of like transfer of capital that was going to solve that. It had to be a law that made people equal in front of the eyes of the law, no matter their status or their skin color or gender. That to me is like very much what it means to be American. It's very important. It's a very important progression we made as a country. And it's essential. And I think in the future, it should be the same. Like, it doesn't matter how much Bitcoin you have, you should be able to have a say and have basic human rights. And that's just what I believe in. And it might be very different from what you believe in.
Having basic human rights versus being able to make a decision on where economic resources are spent are two different things.
Well, but you're not doing that. You're debating who's going to spend the money, and then that person gets to, and then that person's restrained. It's not like the president or your senator gets to decide how to spend the money. They have to negotiate with each other. They have to negotiate with courts, laws, businesses, whatever. It's like one big whole happy family. So there's not, you don't just like elect somebody who spends the money. So I don't know. It's much less direct than that, I guess, today even.
It's a way bigger conversation than what I think we've got time for. Like there's some specific areas that I just want to dig into, but I know it's going to end up blowing the conversation out for another couple of hours. But it's like see, voting, I just think, is a remnant of the past, and it was a remnant of something that we had to go through, which was us trying to build institutions for the basic purpose of private property protection. Really, like if we distill it all down, that's really what it was, these institutions were designed for, and the allocation of pooled resources. Like that's really the two things.
But that's not, I mean, so actually, voting began with a small subset of Americans, and then others fought for the right to have that vote. It used to be only property owners, and the slaves didn't get to vote, and their wives didn't get to vote.
You're talking about the means. What's the end? Why did they want to vote? Why
did they want to vote? So they could have a say in the future of their country. And every American should have a say in the future of their country. And if you want to live in some other country that, I mean, it's so simple. I mean,
what's
voting.
The say give you though? What does the say give you?
It gives you the power to like prevent people who are going to kick the crap out of you from being in office. I mean, like if you want to go live in a country that doesn't have a vote, choose your country. You can go to Saudi Arabia, you can go to China, you can go to North Korea, be my guest. I mean, those are places where people can't vote and they really suck. So I'm just saying, like, you don't want to live in a place where people can't vote. That's a really bad idea today. The evidence points to that. I agree,
but the voting was for a purpose though. And this is sort of what you're describing.
Yeah, to achieve equality.
Shit out of you, steal your stuff.
Equality before the law. No one's ever going to promise equality of outcome. That's nonsense. But equality of opportunity is very important. That's what Bitcoin gives us. So equality of opportunity.
Equality of opportunity is actually a means. What's the end, though? What's the end?
I'll go with equality of opportunity. Good enough for me. What do you got?
No, I think the end is the protection of private property and the say in where resources should be allocated. Like that. So the end result of voting is those two things.
It's just we vote. Really it's difficult to pull away from the reality on the ground. It's difficult to try and say voting is bad when the very best societies.
I'm not saying it's bad. I'm not saying it's bad. I think you're misunderstanding me here, Alex.
Well, you're saying it's a remnant that we're gonna like evolve out of, right?
I'll get to why in a minute, but I'm just saying that voting evolved as a mechanism for people to have a say about two things: being able to decide who gets to, who is the best person or who is the best organization that can protect my private property rights, and who are the best group of people that can distribute our pooled resources. That's really like the, and so I'm not downplaying voting now. I'm saying that it was a necessary mechanism to give individuals the capacity to choose which institution was going to provide those two services.
Okay. So you're saying in the Bitcoin future we won't need that?
That's what I'm saying. So I'm saying
that would assume everybody has Bitcoin. Like, what about like what if there's a whole bunch of people? Yes, they're no coiners and whatever. We can make fun of them, but like, that's going to be messy, man. Like, I don't know. I don't feel great about that.
Fine, but the question for that, the only answer to that question is, how do they get Bitcoin? The question isn't, they have to work for it.
Right. That's fair, and we can debate that. All I'm saying is, like, aside from that, it is very difficult to argue today that like any sort of voting system is bad, given that like all the best places in the world where all these democratic critics live are places where that have voting. So
I agree with that. I agree with that. Voting emerged as sort of like a necessary thing for us to grapple with trying to decide who's going to maintain private property rights and who is going to allocate the resources. Like, we had to. Like, we didn't know what else to do, right?
In a narrow sense, you're correct in as much as Bitcoin relieves us in a way from having to deal with private property. We take it into our own hands. We exert our own private property now. Like, it's actual private property. I don't have to trust the government. I don't have to, like, I have it. It's mine. But like outside of Bitcoin, I don't see that. I still think all the other stuff needs to be like a negotiation between individuals and groups, right? Like
it will,
and security and all those other things.
But I think those things are going to now be done more effective. So, or not now, but in the future will be done more efficiently by paying either insurance or paying direct. In which case, you negate the need for having to elect a group to manage the distribution of collective resources. So that's what I'm saying. So we kind of we almost remove the need to have to vote, because your vote actually becomes who you pay for, like what you pay for. That is actually a vote. It's a big thought. Like,
I mean, like for example, like we have like a nuclear power plant here in California, and there's a big debate over should we keep it open or not. Obviously, I think we should expand nuclear. I mean, obviously, huge mistake for humans to go backwards here. But like, I don't know. It's like there are people who feel otherwise, and we're like debating about it. I mean, I don't think like you can like to do like a I don't know, to do like a fundraiser to figure out how we should do it just seems weird. Like referendum seems fair. I don't know, maybe in the future it'll be different, but like for now, I guess all I want to say is that just to sort of conclude, obviously this has been a lot of fun. I do what I do at Href because I hope that one day everybody can enjoy the fruits of liberal democracies. It's just so tragic that so many people have to live under these horrible dictatorships and monarchies. I don't know what the future brings, but I do think that Bitcoin does promise already escape from some horrible repression already for millions of people. And I hope that it sort of restrains our governments in the future. I don't know if we go to city states or, anything that dramatic. It's possible, but I do think that it just sort of, I think the Bitcoin age will restrain them. So I am hopeful despite all the crazy shit that's happening,
Yeah. Well, dude, I think the work you're doing is incredibly important. And I mean this with the utmost respect. I think I hope, we get to a point where the work you're doing is
not necessary.
Yeah, exactly. Let's make you unemployed.
We do this Oslo Freedom Forum conference, and we always say we wouldn't have to fucking do it if we could do one in every country, but because we can't, we have to do it. If we could do the Oslo Freedom Forum in Tehran and in Beijing and in Pyongyang and in Caracas, it would be pointless. Who cares? We all have human rights. We all have private property. We all have free speech. But that's not the way it works. So we got to keep doing it.
Correct. So yeah, I genuinely hope Bitcoin fucking makes you unemployed, and that you
That
have
would
heaps
be
of Bitcoin,
awesome.
so that you don't have to worry about that. But
It would
yeah,
be great.
I genuinely believe that the future we're moving into is one that is far more meritocratic in nature, far more localized in
Okay.
nature,
Hmm.
and I think it's one where the mistakes uh, are are corrected way quicker.
Hmm.
And if you can continually compound good decision making, you are going to not
Yeah.
only bring yourself forward, but you will have the capacity to. I think we'll see the reemergence of noble families. I think that is going to be a really interesting thing. I think we'll have the reemergence of functional elites, like and what I envision as elites in the natural sense of the term. So not parasitic elites that are able to remain elite because they can be in a position where they get an advantage at the expense of others, but to be an elite because you are adding more value, you're producing more, you're providing more, you're doing more for society in general, right? So I kind of think that society will trend towards that, um, because we'll have the capacity to build you know undilutable wealth, and uncensorable
Let's
interaction amongst individuals.
Yeah, and let's consider this thought experiment. If you're right, then in order to prevent those noble families from being slave owners and colonialists, what needs to happen now is that we got to get as many people to get satoshis as possible now, so that they're not slaves later. So that's why I'm trying to like tell people, come on, like get a few bucks of it. I mean, even 1,000 satoshi. Who knows, man? I mean, we don't know what the future holds. We don't know what's going to happen to fiat currencies. But I have this weird feeling that every time I like spin on the fold card and you get like a few thousand satoshis, I have this weird feeling that like in 100 years, that's going to be pretty nuts. Like a
Yeah,
thousand satoshis might be a
yeah,
big deal. Like it's just weird.
yeah.
So I want to like, I mean, regardless of how we think the future is going to shake out, we got to try and I think it's this whole thing. I know it's funny to say that like, oh, you deserve Bitcoin at the price you buy into. I sort of agree, but like let's get people to like be more deserving faster. Like let's get them. I think it's actually morally important to like spread the word about this now to the people that you love and care about and care and you want to support their cause, as opposed to just like sitting around and like, oh, whatever, they'll figure it out. They probably won't.
What
I
you're
wouldn't have figured it
Yeah,
out unless someone had forced me to like look at it.
what you're defining there is the difference between a nice transition versus a messy transition. That's all.
Right.
Because the seriously, the transition is going to happen
Oh, I
anyway,
know.
but
It's
it's
inevitable.
it's either it's either going to be a bunch of angry fucking people who don't have any Bitcoin, who are going to have to work shit jobs in order to earn it, and a lot of them, they're going to have come from potentially a background where they had bullshit jobs that were a remnant of a fiat society, and
Yeah.
now that job doesn't exist anymore, so they're going to have to do something shit like dig fucking ditches or something like that, and they're going to be angry and they're going to want to use violence to obtain some sort of
Yeah. I
Bitcoin or
mean,
some
look,
sort of
this whole
property from someone
decade
else, and
is
that's a
like
messy fucking thing.
I believe we're at this sort of the bottom of that S curve where I think we're going to go from like one or what we're at like 1% adoption globally. Maybe we'll go, 1 to 2% in the next couple of years. But then I think this decade, we're going to go to like 10 to 15 to 20%. And that's where you have, I think, the most ability to make an impact ever, like potentially ever.
Mm.
I mean, who knows
Yeah, yeah,
how long this UTXO set survives? Could be hundreds of years. So in the next 2 decades, like everybody listening, you have the power to like really make a difference for the people that you care about and causes you care about. And like, if there's like vulnerable populations or folks that have been screwed, you can teach them about Bitcoin. They can get in now and they can have that power that can never be taken from them. But this is a moment in time. Like we're not going to have this again. It's not going to be another
we
Bitcoin.
will not.
Like,
Yeah, yeah,
so,
yeah,
so
yeah.
like the next decade is so important. So that's why I'm just like so driven to try and get people to understand this and, the endless the endless just buffoonery on the internet of people who don't get it is very tiresome, but whatever, man. I've got the energy. One day I won't have the energy and I'll stop doing it. But for now, I'm like, I'll fight with them all day. It's fine. You know, if it can just convince one of their followers, then it'll be worth it, you know?
I'm right there with you, brother.
Well, it's been a lot of fun.
Right,
I really appreciate this very deep dive where we covered like just thousands of years and all sorts of shit. It's been a blast and a pleasure.
100%. 100%. Thank you for coming on, man. Can you quickly just tell people where they can find you and where they can support the work you're doing?
Absolutely. Yeah. So you can find me on Twitter or Clubhouse at Gladstein, Gladstein. The Human Rights Foundation is at hrf.org or hrf on Twitter. We're going to be welcoming our chairman, Gary Kasparov, to Clubhouse next week, which will be a lot of fun. We're going to have Eric Weinstein and involved with that next Thursday at 5 p.m. So you can check that out. And if you want to learn about our work in Bitcoin, you can do that at href.org/devfund, DEVFUND, where we are supporting Bitcoin developers and wallets and people in the ecosystem. So doing our best to bring together the worlds of human rights and freedom in Bitcoin, and just, you know, happy to be on this journey.
All right, my man. Thank you so much. I will make sure that I chuck all that in the show notes. And yeah, man, hopefully we should do this again in like a year or so, maybe even 2 years, just to sort of see see how things have transformed. Actually, you know what? A yearly one of these would be fucking great.
I mean, if you think about what's happened to Hong Kong in the last 18 months, I think a yearly one is quite reasonable, actually. The world is changing so fast, you know?
Indeed. All right, my man. Well, look, hopefully I'll see you in Miami. If I don't, then we'll cross paths somewhere along the line for sure.
Absolutely.
All right, man. Thanks, Alex.
Thank you.